I want to first start out with the hot topic in the news these days, which is tariffs. Roger, I'll go to you first. I'm wondering what you think the Trump administration's tariffs mean for the climate for startups today.
All right, so when we think about tariffs and the climate, I think we should talk about three separate things. One is the process, the on, the off, et cetera, which is creating quite a bit of volatility. I think that has put a little bit of a damper on startups and others, in part because many people were thinking that there would be a number of exits that might emerge, new liquidity could come back into the sector, and that really hasn't happened. So that's process. Then the tariffs themselves, he's already put a 10% base tariff on everything, plus a much higher tariffs on Chinese imports. That has already started to weigh on a number of sectors already. People don't recognize it, but already the amount of money that's being collected or the amount of tariffs is higher than it's been since the early 1900s. And so that's affecting society overall, raising costs very quietly, but across a number of industries. And then there's the future prospect of even higher tariffs. So net, I'd say created greater uncertainty, slowed and created volatility, and in some sectors starting to increase cost. And all three of those things, I think, are a little bit of a problem for startups and smaller industry companies, smaller companies.
Matthew, can I get your thoughts on that? And I mean, if the tariffs go away tomorrow, does that erase the challenge facing startups?
Well, I think there's really just an enormous amount of uncertainty, which is in the world right now. And so I think the challenge is when you have uncertainty as an investor, as a startup, it's harder to make the investments if you don't know if the foundation that you're building on is actually going to be stable. So I think that if the tariffs go away tomorrow, but then there's a prospect they're going to come back the next day, that uncertainty is the real challenge. I think stability and predictability is what you really need in an investing environment. And it's really what you need if you're going to be building and investing in a new company.
Mm-hmm. And does the administration's deregulatory agenda balance things out at all? I mean, what does that do for startups or companies more broadly?
I mean, again, I think it's going to depend on a company by company basis whether you were particularly subject to regulation or not subject to regulation. What I think is I don't know that we know what the administration's agenda is long term. We right now just have a bunch of action and then revoking that action and different things coming. What I would hope is that there is some level of stability. There's some place that we get to where the news every day isn't that the plan has changed. And if we get to that, I think that's better for any kind of startup investment.
Mm-hmm. Roger, I wanted to bring in AI here. Obviously, that's something that we're all talking about in Washington and beyond. How does AI change the game for startups?
Well, let me answer that question sort of in the context of the company where I'm the CIO. My company is called Red Cell Partners, and we are an incubator of startup companies, many of them driven by AI, so I see it through that light. And I think the answer is AI can be quite a game changer for a large number of companies. Some of them are AI companies, some of them will use AI as input. But very importantly, once you think about this, not as those very large, highly expensive large language models, which all of us talk about and use, from Gemini and others, but it's really the focus of that kind of analytical capability on smaller sectors, industry-specific, company-specific. And I think it can actually be for many small and medium-sized companies and startups, such as ones that we do at Red Cell, a real game changer. You can define what your company is and make your company differentiated from many others in the marketplace.
Are there any companies you feel like are taking advantage of AI in a way that's sort of setting them apart?
Well, again, I can speak to the companies that we at Red Cell have started. So we've got one that's called DEFCON AI, and it is doing what's called contested logistics for the Department of Defense. And I think it's really, setting itself apart from others. And there'll be a number also in healthcare as well that we are doing. So Zephyr AI is another one. So there are a number of companies that I know personally that I think are using AI in a way that differentiates them from others.
What do you think, Matthew? What do you see as the opportunities for AI and the businesses more broadly?
I think there are the obvious things, which are, we use AI internally now to help our customer support team be more effective. We've hired fewer people on customer support, but they do a better job in that. We use it in our finance team to be able to predict when like a customer is going to pay late, or when churn might happen, or when someone might be ready to upgrade. And I think everyone is going to find those sorts of areas. The place where I think there's the biggest risk and maybe the biggest opportunity is that AI is going to change the user interface of the internet and the web and how we've all experienced it. To date, the business model of the web, what's sat behind it, really is based on search. You search for something, you go there, and then when you're there, whether it's Semafor or any publisher or an application that's out there, you're able to then derive value from that, whether it's monetary value by selling subscriptions or posting ads, or just ego, right? You know that someone is reading these things. That is changing. We've already seen that change in relatively mild ways. And the best stat of this is 10 years ago, for every visitor that Google would send to you, they would crawl 2 pages. So the ratio was 2 pages crawled to 1 visitor. Today, the crawl rate has stayed exactly the same, but it's now 6 to 1. So what's changed? The change is that Google now answers 75% of the queries that they get without you having to leave Google. So you don't have to go to those 10 blue links and click to the original source. You're getting the answer directly on Google, and that's made it much harder for any original content creators that are monetizing through subscriptions or ads or anything like that. That's the good news. If you look at OpenAI, the ratio is 250 to 1. If you look at Anthropic, it's 6,000 to 1. And so if original content creators are struggling at 6 to 1, I think there has to be a new business model that exists for those original content creators if we're going to be in a world where more and more questions are getting answered without you having to go to the original source. And I think that is incredibly terrifying to a lot of the publishing industry today. But I actually think there's an opportunity to create sort of this new wave of value that original content creators are out there creating. I live in Park City, Utah. It matters to me enormously whether it snows more on the east side of the mountain or the west side of the mountain. And so I subscribe to a weather forecaster who will give me that precise data. If that's coming to AI, then that forecaster can now start to actually sell that data to the various AI models so that I can then ask it, where should I go skiing this morning? And it would tell me one side of the mountain versus the other. So I think that there can actually be a reemergence of this niche technology, this niche content creation, but we need something which is a different model than search. And I think that's both the most terrifying thing that's going on in AI right now, and also maybe the most exciting opportunity.
So what might that different model look like then?
Pay for crawl. Like you literally, as the AI companies crawl, you can do it. My sort of utopian vision for the future is humans should get back to getting content for free, and robots should pay a ton for it.
Interesting. You mentioned risks. Are there other risks that you see associated with AI?
I think there's going to be, and we should all just prepare ourselves, there's going to be a huge sort of wave of horrible headlines over the course of the next 24 months. Families that lose their life savings because it sounded like their daughter called them from a Mexican prison and said, you need to wire $1 million or I'm not getting out. The number of, like my elderly parents who get tricked into revealing some secret because someone who sounded like they were from their bank called up and knew a lot about them. AI is going to make the scammers' jobs easier. And again, I think that those are going to be horrible, horrible headlines. And it does create some risk that anywhere that we have relied on someone sounding a certain way or looking a certain way in order to prove their identity, that's going to break down. But I think the good news is that at the end of the day, again, we are in the cybersecurity space. My job at some level is to scare you into buying our products. But I think that's actually, those headlines are going to be the exception, not the rule. I think over time, AI actually is going to make the web, make the internet more secure. And we see that every day. Our machine learning systems, we wouldn't have the arrogance to call them AI, but our machine learning systems take the feed of data of all of the traffic that flows through Cloudflare's network and are now surfacing new cyber attacks as threats that no human has ever identified before. And that ability for us to use an enormous amount of data, process it incredibly quickly, and actually turn that around and make the internet more secure as a result, I think is again, it's going to sound really scary in the short term, but over the long term, I think we're actually going to have a much more secure internet.
Roger, I wanted to talk about, ask you about AI regulation because it's something that we hear a lot about on Capitol Hill. Obviously, the Biden administration and the Trump administration have both tried their own executive actions on AI. You used to be a regulator at the Fed, which is a different position than you hold now. When you see lawmakers, policymakers think about AI regulation, what should they be thinking about in terms of the do's and don'ts of good AI regulation?
Right, so again, speaking from a history of being a different kind of regulator in financial services, a couple of do's and don'ts, as I see it. First, don't rush. These things are changing pretty quickly. Hard to know exactly what you're regulating, and certainly don't know why you're regulating it necessarily. So one of the don'ts is don't just jump in head first to it. Secondly, don't do it without talking to and consulting the industry. Consulting is not the same thing as necessarily doing exactly what they ask, but what I learned at the Federal Reserve and other places is you've got to go and talk to the experts about what's going on, how it's working, what are they thinking, et cetera. And so don't do it without bringing the industry in for consultation. Flip side of all of that, listen to a bunch of experts. Talk to people like Matthew, talk to others, exactly what are the risks that we need to worry about, and what are the risks that are maybe sort of made up and more hyper. And also I'd say one of the do's is learn from history. We know a lot about different kinds of regulations in financial services or in transportation, et cetera. And think about what has worked in the past and what are you worried about. And particularly when it comes to AI, it's going to be very, very hard to regulate knowledge. It's going to be hard to regulate models per se. Where you might be able to regulate is the interface between the model and the human being, because what you're trying to avoid is harm and damage being done. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing that Matthew and others are talking about. And so, how do you think about that kind of regulation where you're trying to avoid a specific harm and drive that? Mm-hmm. And the final thing I'd say in AI is the major players, the major producers, are very interested in having this be perceived as being very successful. Mm-hmm. And so the possibility of public-private partnerships really exists. I think of this as sort of the very, very beginning of electricity. When electricity was first being popularized with Westinghouse and Tesla and others, the last thing they wanted was bad headlines of the type that you just heard about. They didn't want houses burning down because of electricity. And so the thought process had to be, how do we make this new thing safe so that we can expand the use of it? Mm-hmm. And so recognizing as a do that the industry has the same general goals and objectives as regulators, which is to create a very safe, secure model. Whenever you have new technology coming in, those that are driving it want adoption, and in order to get adoption, what they want is a set of rules that make it safe to work with. Mm-hmm. And so those are some of the do's and don'ts that I've learned.
I wanted to drill down on one thing you mentioned, just the need to not rush. But when the technology is moving so fast, I guess what's the balance there? Is there a risk of policymakers acting or moving too slowly so it becomes obsolete?
Look, there's always a risk of moving too slowly. I don't think that risk is massive here because this is going to be with us for a long period of time, mm-hmm. right? So I think of this a little bit. I just use one analogy, electricity. The other analogy is automobiles, right? It took us a little while to figure out here in the U.S., drive on one side, not on the other, how stoplights work, what happens at an intersection. Frankly, you had to learn all of that by watching how these machines were working when they weren't regulated. And so, I think being attuned to what are the real risks and then figure out how to respond to that. But throwing a regulation in right now that could end up, particularly given the geopolitical context, slowing down developments here in the U.S., I think is also something to worry about. So there are risks on going too fast, risks on going too slow. And most importantly, I think there's a risk on over-regulating before we know exactly what the dangers are that we have to worry about.
Matthew, I want to give you a chance to weigh in here. What do you see as the federal government's role in AI regulation?
So the challenge here is that this technology behaves in the opposite way of every other technology that we've ever thought. Mm-hmm. Most of the time as technology advances, it becomes more predictable, right? So as we get better at making steel, then we know exactly how much a certain grade of steel can hold up a building. As we get better at writing computer programs, we know that when you push the button, the screen turns blue, and every time you push the button, the screen is going to turn blue, and if you push the button, the screen doesn't turn blue, then there's a bug. AI is different. AI is, by its very design, designed to be non-deterministic, where you want to be able to put information in and then something comes out. And that's what's been so amazing to all of us as we have experimented with these tools, where you put something in and it almost feels like it is being creative. It may actually almost be being creative. And what that means is that it is very, very difficult to regulate outputs. It is very difficult to say, make sure your AI never does X. And what's been interesting is, for quite some time, and I think there's been a change in policymaking in China over the course of the last 6 months, but for a very long period of time, even though China had all the investment, even though China had all the technology, even though they were working in this area, they actually were way behind in AI, because if you are at Google and you make an AI and Kevin Roose from the New York Times gets it to act like a Nazi, which is basically Kevin's job, that's very embarrassing to Google, but nobody goes to jail. If you're Baidu and your new AI, suddenly you ask it to pretend to be, what was it like to be a student protester in Tiananmen Square in 1989? That was just completely verboten. In the last 6 months, China's policy has changed to actually relax the amount of regulation on outputs, and as a result, you see DeepSeek, you see what Baidu is doing, you see that change. And I think that that's a good lesson for policymakers here. What held China back was the fear that these non-deterministic systems would act non-deterministically. As soon as they relaxed those regulations, you saw a just bloom in the amount of AI innovation that was coming out. And I think that is a warning sign to regulators in the US and Europe that if we crack down too much on saying this unpredictable machine you have to make predictable, that's going to hold back what is going on in AI. And so we have to think about what are the actual results. And when you push people, when you push the AI doomers out there on like what are they really worried about, you push them and push them, there really is one area that they're specifically worried about, which is actually pathogen design or some sort of chemical design that could be used. And so I think let's focus on where the real challenges are. Let's focus on where the real problems are. Let's figure out how to constrain those. But mostly, let's try to make sure that we don't take a thing where you can't predict what the outputs are and then force companies to make an unpredictable system predictable.
I'm glad you mentioned China because I did want to ask you, from your vantage point, do you think the U.S. it risks losing its edge compared to China on AI?
6 months ago, I would have said that the fact that China was regulating outputs was always going to put them at a disadvantage. And something feels like it has changed, and the actual policies have changed there. And there is innovation now in the AI space, which has just rapidly accelerated there. And I think that we should, again, be cognizant that it was a policy change that was holding China back. As they have relaxed that policy change, I think that has allowed them to go forward. But I think they will always be at somewhat of a disadvantage because of the fact that they won't tolerate these AI systems being unpredictable. They won't tolerate them criticizing the government. They won't tolerate them doing other things. That's always going to make it much more difficult to have real innovation over the long term.
Can I get your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd agree with that last point. I think part of the challenge vis-a-vis any totalitarian society is just the point that Matthew made. They're worried about the outputs. And as soon as you constrain the outputs, what you're doing in some sense is constraining the creativity of the individual standing behind it, creating fear, anxiety, et cetera. A place where I think the issue might be closer is just the amount of data that different countries have, particularly like China. Think about facial recognition as a prime example. And also think about their willingness perhaps to violate things like copyright and just gather up much more data. And so I think that's a challenge. Where I think we here in the US, I hope, are still in a good position is we have, out of all of the leading AI scientists, the vast majority of them currently are in the US. here I emphasize the word currently because there's nothing that stops people from moving. And so the question of who wins, so to speak, if that's the right way to think about it, depends very much on a point that Matthew made and that you raised earlier. It's how society recognizes and works with these new technologies to make them both safe, but also to give people a chance to experiment with them. And you know, the societal context, I think, is one which overall, I believe the U.S. will be in a better position because we are more willing to allow the kind of experimentation that Matthew talked about, and because I believe our policymakers actually do listen to things like this when you say, well, how much should you regulate? His lesson, my lesson, regulate carefully, regulate slowly. Those kinds of things, I think, resonate more with our policymakers than perhaps they do in China.
Roger, Matthew, thank you so much. We're out of time. It's a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.